Okay, let's see how are things going with your coding and results and discussion.
I haven't started the discussion.
Okay.
As I told you, I need help.
Okay.
And I think I did with the coding. I like classified all the questions.
Okay. Now I uploaded an announcement, I think it was last week, and I don't know if you had a chance to look at that, but I explained that we also need to include at the end of your document in the appendix a list of the codes that you used, and I included a link to an example that basically looked like this. It had categories, and it was like an outline. So, like you had categories and you had subcategories, and then codes, right? And so, like you had a category, and this would be, your category, and then this would be your subcategory, and then you had your codes. Let's see. And then you would have maybe another category, subcategory, let's see, codes. Okay. Now, before break, I explained that when you did your analysis, you would end up with probably several codes, right? And once you have those codes listed out, where you are basically labeling your data, you go back and say, okay, these codes probably are going to be, I'm going to categorize these. So these are codes, and maybe categories. Maybe I categorize all these codes as this category. And then maybe these codes I categorize as this, and maybe these codes I categorize as this, and so on, right? And then you might look at these two categories and say, okay, these two categories fall under a certain theme. These two categories, maybe they fall under a certain theme. Okay? So like this would be category 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe categories 1 and 2 fall under this one theme. 3 and 4 maybe fall under a second theme. That's an example. The idea is that you're moving from very specific codes to, in these case, categories, in this case, to themes. You're going from the specific to the general. This is part of the analysis that you need to do once you have all of these different codes that you're using here, when you're looking at each little chunk of language, right? So when we talked about codes, categories, and themes, it's the same basically as them calling it categories, subcategories, and codes. It's the same idea. We're just using different words. Okay? If you want to say themes, categories, and codes, that's fine. But you need to have some sort of outline that has these names, these labels. And not only the individual codes, but also these other categories or subcategories or whatever. So once you have this listed out, you need to add this to your document as an appendix and mention it in the methods section, in the procedural section. So after you talk about, I collected data this way, this is how I collected the data. I analyzed the data using these codes, see appendix F, right? And then so they can see the reader can see how you categorized your information. Okay. So does this make sense? These codes are going to be used for all of your data sources, your interviews, your observations, any types of data sources that you use. You're going to accumulate these codes, and you might have the same text might include 1 or 2, maybe even 3 different codes. It's okay. You can label the same chunk of language several codes as long as you're coding information or labeling information that helps you with your analysis based on your research questions. So there may be text where you don't analyze. Maybe it has nothing to do with your study and you feel that it's not part of your research. You don't have to label. You only label what is part of your, that you feel is part of your research, that's part of your answering your research questions.
Okay.
Okay? So the first step is to go through and obviously categorize and then move into these either categories and themes or subcategories. Categories, whatever you want to call it, to get some.
I can do either this or this?
Yeah, what I'm trying to say here is it doesn't matter if you use these terms, codes, categories, or themes, or if you use this terminology, categories, subcategories, and codes. It's the same idea.
Okay.
This process is the same. I just didn't want you to be confused when you looked at the example when you said categories, subcategories, and codes. What this has to do with codes, categories that we talked about. And so what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter, you know, whether you call them these or whether you call it codes, categories, or themes, or whether you call it categories or subcategories or codes. It's the same. Codes, though, are codes. Codes are the individual chunks of labels that based on the language that you're analyzing. And this is the most detailed. And then this goes more general and even more general.
Okay.
Okay?
So this is what I have to include in the appendix.
Right.
Right? That, like,
and probably after your instruments.
But for example, where is it? Here. What I did is this is like my category types of questions made by the teacher, and then I have divided into content, yes, no, and open-ended. And here are the questions.
Okay. So the codes, what would be the codes in this case?
That's my question.
Okay, I guess open-ended, are these the codes, yes, no questions, and content? I think it would be easier to try to label it like this in an outline.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of backwards to how you actually did it. So this is also, I did this graph, this representation here, so you can see this is how you probably did it. You started with the codes, then you moved to categories and themes in your analysis. But when you write out your codes, do the opposite. Start with categories, and then which categories would be themes, right? Subcategories or categories, and codes are the codes. So this is what your appendix should look like. This is probably how you thought through when you did your analysis. So these codes are these individual codes here.
The codes are not the questions.
Sorry?
The codes are not the questions in this case, or
yeah, I mean maybe the codes is like WH, not even WH questions. Maybe how questions, what questions, where questions, when questions. Ese es como de más detallado
Okay.
Yes, no questions, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you have questions based on function. I don't know how you analyze. Eliciting information, checking for understanding. However you classified the questions,
Mm-hmm.
but the very detailed, that falls under codes. So then, let's say you have what questions, how questions, why questions, when questions. Okay, so maybe that falls under a category of content questions. Okay, yes, no questions probably has its own category. Yes, no question, even though it's the same category, the same code. It makes sense because you're comparing yes, no questions to content questions, right? If you do it by function, are you eliciting information, checking for understanding, reviewing? Is it something new, right? Like looking out the content of the question. Then you figure out any category that makes sense. How do you classify? But maybe these are by function. So you have a category, and these are the function. The questions by function. And again, what I mean by function is that are they listing information, checking for understanding, right? And then maybe you have a theme. Okay, themes are maybe here a theme might be to check for prior knowledge here, or maybe some of these categories are checking for understanding. Maybe there's a theme of repetition, perhaps. I don't know.
I don't have that kind of questions, like function.
Okay.
No.
All right. So what are your codes that you have here? So
I divided into content, yes, no, and open-ended.
all right. You probably need to go deeper into these codes, like what questions, what how questions, when questions, like how many what questions did they ask? How many where, when, why? Because I think that's an important part of your research, not just content, because they may ask, well, okay, content questions, but were they all what questions? Because a what question, as you know, is a lot different than a why question as far as critical thinking. And critical thinking might be another category. Maybe you have content questions as one category, maybe you have critical thinking. Maybe some of these codes fall under critical thinking, maybe lower basic thinking, or maybe that's a theme up here. Okay, so you have to work this out. I think in this case, in your case, you need to be more specific first, and then think in terms of, okay, your research questions, critical thinking or not, and classify these accordingly. But I think go deeper in here. Hopefully you can find these codes here. Just count how many what, where, when, why questions, and go from there and see if there is any other codes that you might include here.
For example, in those questions like do you think or do you believe?
Okay, so for example, do you think that's a yes or no question? So that's one code. Okay. Now the same text, you can give another label. Same text. So we'll label the same text yes, no, and we'll put another label on there, maybe beliefs. Anytime that they ask about beliefs, what do you believe? Okay, well maybe that's another code, because that's a different question. What do you believe? Then maybe, is this blue, or what color is this, or is this correct? I mean, so they're non-belief questions. So that's what I mean by function, in the sense you're asking questions like, look at the actual content of the question. And so when they say, what do you believe, or do you believe that this, or do you think, maybe you have a classification for think questions. Okay. Maybe there's some other types of questions here that you can classify differently.
Should we try to give a proposal to the government? Or what should we do? Should we do something directly at Thesis?
Okay, so they're asking questions like do questions. What should we do? Maybe that's a classification. Maybe that's a category, like to take action. What should we do? Maybe. And that's kind of related to beliefs, but it doesn't, whatever makes sense to you. I mean, if it makes sense to put do questions and then put do as a category, or beliefs, put beliefs. There's no right or wrong answer to the labeling. It has to help you analyze what it is you want to analyze. So you come up with terms that make sense to you, that help you make sense of these. But look not just at the what question, but the actual content to see, okay, what is it that they're asking? Yeah. Because I think you're going to see some patterns there. You're going to see some patterns that, okay, they seem to always ask, I don't know, do questions after think questions or something like that. I mean, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for patterns.
Okay.
So my point here is use different labels for the same text. Create more codes. And even if you have, sometimes you might even have 3 labels on the same text, the same question. Depends on what it is you're looking at that you want to analyze.
Okay. So, just to clarify, for example, the code is the question, yeah? Or like, for example,
yeah, it's the label that you're giving a chunk of text. It could be the whole.
I write all the question, yes?
You would probably write the whole question because it's not that long. Now you could also write chunks of text. Maybe there's no rule here to do the whole question or chunks of questions, but I think it'll be easier to analyze later if you have the whole question, so you can see the whole question. But you can also do chunks of language if you want. So, for example, like how.
Who?
So what does it say? Who
wants to give me a point of view?
Okay, so point of view, perspective. All right, so maybe that's a code. Perspective,
okay.
A point of view. Now you have two options. You can select the whole text, the whole question, or you just select point of view. Now, which one do you choose? Well, it depends on what's easier for you to analyze, because you have to go back and say, okay, this code, what is the text? Point of view. Okay, it's a point of view question. Okay, maybe that's all you need.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it would help you to have the entire text. So you decide, but the idea is that you're looking at individual chunks of this language and saying, okay, point of view, it's a who question. Yeah, maybe that's all you have. Two labels for this question. Then you go on to the next one. This is a what, and so on.
You wanna cry?
Don't cry. Don't cry. Does that make sense?
No.
No, it doesn't make sense?
No.
Okay.
Here
Yes.
are going to be the questions. Like, for example, a code. The code would be like point of view, right? But then here.
Okay, point of view, and maybe you have another question that is who.
Okay.
So you have two codes, point of view, who.
Okay.
Now, that's the code. You're asking me if it should be the whole question or not, and I'm saying it doesn't really matter. I mean, you can choose to select only point of view, or you can select the whole text. Okay. But the code probably is just going to be point of view.
Okay. Or
perspective, if you want. Whatever's short and sweet that makes that you know what it is. Perspective, who. Okay. You're going to have other codes. What? Perspective. Who? Beliefs. SE. Dependent. Right? You're going to. All right. So you're going to have all these different codes. Then once you have all these codes, you start arranging these codes in some sort of form that relates to certain categories.
Okay.
See, so you might have all like content category. You're probably going to have a content category. Oh. So you're going to have the whats and the hows and the wheres and the whens, whys, and so on. Okay. Everything except for the yes no. Okay. You might have a yes no, and probably a yes no is going to be also a category.
For example, when he asks like, do you think, or yes. All the questions that starts with the.
Right, that's a yes no. Do you think that the sky is blue? Yes.
Have you seen this?
Have you seen this? Yes. That's a yes no question.
Okay.
So that's another code. And in this case, bring that. You're probably not going to have any other codes that relate to that, maybe. So yes no could be just a yes no category. Okay. Maybe these yes no questions you want to put into a lower cognitive category, because you have high order thinking, so maybe you have another category for lower thinking ability or whatever. And so you start putting these into different categories.
Okay.
Whatever makes sense. I mean, this is just an example, but the process is what I want you to be clear on. First, I think you need to be more specific in some of your codes. So you have a lot of different codes. And then you go back and say, okay, these codes go here, these codes go here, these codes go here, in these categories. And then you see and look for certain themes that come from these categories. Again, I'm using codes, categories, or themes. You can call it codes, subcategories, or categories. If that's easier for you to understand, that's fine. It's the same. We're just giving different layers of labels. This is a label, this is one level, this is another level, and this is another level. Same way here. This is a level, this is a level, and this is a level. Okay?
Okay.
Always.
All this is going to be with my questions, right?
It's going to be with all of your data sources.
Okay.
Your observations, your interviews, your transcriptions, So look at that. This process is the same for all of your data, whether it's a document, you're analyzing a document, or a questionnaire, or your transcription. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Always. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Now, questions up to this point?
For example, I don't know if I should include also the exchange, the verbal exchanges. Do you remember that I also mentioned? But it's very, I don't know, it doesn't have sense sometimes.
Because the verbal exchange, that could be another label, right? So you get one question could also be initiation, response, and follow-up. And that's easy to do. You recognize them now.
Yeah.
You just put the labels in there and then see when you see the codes listed out, then that's when you start to see maybe some patterns. Now you're saying now that maybe there's no patterns.
Because, for example, he asks something and the students start talking, but a lot of time, and then he continues, and it's like a long discussion. So it's not like only, for example, here, what should we do? And she said like, maybe the education about and she couldn't say recycling or something, and she said recycling, and she recycling, yes. So, but in the other part that when I was transcribing, I was checking that is not.
I mean, for example, one pattern that I'm just thinking out loud that's possible is that the initiation, each initiation starts with maybe a content question, or maybe a yes/no question, but it's a question that follows another category that is critical thinking. Okay, that we looked at earlier, where they ask questions like, what is your perspective on X? Okay, so I would assume that most initiations start with some sort of question that relates to either perspective, some sort of higher critical thinking skill, I'm assuming. And then you have a follow-up from a student, and then, initiation, follow-up, or response, okay, and then a follow-up. So the students respond, and then the teacher probably follows up by saying, yes, right, good, right? So, and then the teacher will create another initiation, perhaps, asking another question that's probably still related to the higher order of thinking. But what I'm curious about, and maybe what you might be curious about knowing, is in those initiations, those are like the key times, perhaps. Okay, so when does he start with content questions and move to yes, no, or yes, no to content, or what's the tendency? How does that flow from initiation to initiation to initiation? No, not so much the nitty-gritty, the details of the initiation, response, follow-up necessarily. You have to know where those are, but maybe you're interested in only those initiations, and looking at the discourse to say, okay, what is he doing? Is he going easy and then going into more difficult questions, or vice versa? Is there a pattern? Or maybe there isn't a pattern, and that's fine too. But you can talk about it. You can say, look, this is not a pattern. One day they did this, another day he did this, and there's no pattern. That's fine. But you did the analysis, and that's part of your results. Maybe you ask a question about that, maybe not. I don't know if you ask any questions about how they promote critical thinking skills or whatever. But you know, that's what you're after. So don't worry about if there's nothing there. I would dig a little bit deeper in some of your codes. Maybe you find something that you haven't found yet. If you are looking more, not so much at the WH questions. I mean, look at that, but also look at the content. Like, did he start with perspective questions first and then go into do questions, or vice versa, whatever?
No, for example, if you check the transcription of the here how I
Categorize.
yeah, it doesn't have like an order. It's
Okay.
like not very how can I say structured.
Okay.
I know they are talking on the class and about the topic obviously, but it's not like
okay. So
this,
all right. Another good thing about the looking at it from the exchanges is to see, also look for patterns from the follow-up and the responses to the initiation. So maybe there's no pattern from initiation to initiation, but maybe there's a pattern or a link from what's the student responded to or a follow-up and how they transitioned into that. Maybe, you know, somebody might have said something about airplanes and then he initiated a question about airplanes. Something like that.
Yeah, for example, in one that I remember, he was talking something about the reusing of garbage, I don't know.
Recycling or something.
Yeah. And then another student told him like, oh yes, but that could be more like recycling because the newspapers and I don't know. And then he says, okay, so what could be the difference between reducing and recycling?
Well, there you go. That's something, right? That's something. And you can talk in terms of initiation. He linked an initiation of the exchange from a follow-up from the prior exchange. Right? You're using these terms in your explanation, these technical terms. See what I mean? And it's not just saying he asked a question based on what a student said. No. He asked a question in initiation based on a follow-up or a response to a follow-up to a prior initiation. I see with technical terms, and you talk about how that link, how the teacher linked those ideas. But you can also talk about where he didn't. You know, as you can say, there's no apparent pattern between each initiation, and you can give examples. One initiation, he asked this. Another, the next one, he asked this. Another time, he did it this way, and there's no logic to it necessarily. But, and then you go into, okay, he linked. Let's see. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and what you want is to talk about the most relevant information, of course, but don't think that it's not relevant just because there's no, you know, in this case, there's no evidence of the logic and the order in which, because I think that it's important to state that in this case, in the initiation, there is no link, but explain what it is. Explain what the link is not. I mean, explain what it's not. So that the reader can see, okay, I see what you mean. Right? It's one thing for you just to say, oh, there's no link between initiation and initiation. That's your interpretation. But you haven't provided the results.
Okay.
So say the results. The teacher said this, the teacher said this, these types of questions, and there's no link. So there you presented the results, then your discussion. And that's important not just in the results and discussion section, obviously, but when you're presenting your presentation to the senior values. You don't ever just give your discussion, your opinion, your interpretation without giving the results. Show the results, then your interpretation. That way the audience can see, okay, I see what you mean. Instead of just saying, okay, you say that there's no relationship. Well, how do you know there's no relationship, right? When they ask you that type of question, then you haven't presented the results, or you haven't presented the results in a way that they understand. Okay.
Okay.
Does that help?
Kind of.
Kind of. So, real quick, do you have class?
Till
Do you have time?
11.
Okay. Results. Any other questions about the coding you want to talk about?
No.
Okay. Now, once you have finished this information here, you need to begin writing up your results and discussion. And right now, after you do this analysis, it should be fairly obvious, hopefully, how you want to divide up your results and discussion section. We need to have a results and discussion section of about 2,500 words. So I am suggesting that you divide it up into approximately 2 to 3 sections, just like very much like you did in the later review.
Okay.
So, just as an example, can we think of maybe 2 or 3 sections that we can use as an example here, how you might divide up your results and discussion section? Just to kind of, and it can change. This is not just to kind of go through this explanation.
I don't really have idea about how to start that part.
All right. So, your research questions. What are your research questions?
Yeah.
Do you have those?
But I don't really. What questions?
Like something about critical thinking, critical thinking skills, and
Yeah.
up here.
Critical thinking. When is how, when, and why.
How, when, and why?
How teachers ask questions. Why teacher ask questions to students. Yeah. Well, how do they promote critical thinking? I don't remember.
All right. Nice. All right, so the types of questions. How do teachers present questions? All right, let's do this. Let's lump the what and the how together, and we'll have another section for the why.
Okay.
So we'll do kind of the what and the how. So let's say this is one section, and this is the second section for why. And you're going to have a heading here that is more descriptive. This is just as an example. Now, what are your data sources that you have? What are the different data sources? You have interviews, right? See?
Are more like observations and transcription.
And observations. What else?
Recording.
Well, the recording is
yeah.
that's of the observations. You don't have any interviews with teachers or students?
With teacher.
Okay. Any others?
No. I didn't apply questionnaires to the students.
To the teachers?
Only to
the initial. You have like initial questionnaire, ¿no?
Yeah.
¿Algo más?
No.
Vale. Supongo que tienes también los tres para Uruguay, ¿no? And questionnaire. Okay. Now, the first thing you need to do when you talk about this section is you need to come up with some concepts.
Okay.
Whatever they are, think of some ideas that you want to talk about. I'm just putting 3 here. However many ideas you need to include. Okay. Remember that it's 2,500 words, so you're going to divide this up more or less 50-50, right? More or less. Whatever concept that you talk about, you need to try to discuss it in terms of all 3 data sources. Information from your observations, your transcripts, your interviews, transcriptions from your interviews, and your questionnaire. Now, ideally, you should have 3 of these data sources. This is triangulation. This is what you should try to shoot for. You should at least have 2 data sources, though. At least 2. So if you say, well, I don't have a 3rd one, okay, it's not great, but at least 2.
Okay.
All right. Do not talk about anything. Do not talk about any concept using 1 data source. Even if it's super interesting, important, it answers your research question. If you only have 1 data source, you're better off not mentioning it at all. Why? Because when someone tells you, for example, in the interview, the teacher tells you something, oh, that's really good information, I'm going to use it. But you don't observe it. You don't have any other, you didn't see it in class, they didn't say anything, or you didn't ask in the questionnaire, then the senior analysts are going to say, well, okay, that's interesting, but what did you observe? Well, I didn't see it. Well, did you ask anything in the questionnaire? Well, no. You don't have another perspective. Whatever it is you want to talk about, it's best to have different perspectives so that you better understand the concept that you're talking about. Right? If you tell me one thing and I only hear it from you, that's different than if you tell me and 3 of your classmates tell me the same thing. Or you tell me and a teacher tells me and somebody else tells me off the street the same thing, well then, okay, that's different than if just you tell me. So every concept that you talk about, you want to try to include all 3 data sources. You want to try to triangulate the information for every concept that you want to talk about in the same way here. Okay? Using these data sources. So, whatever. Okay? So, that's one thing. Now you have basically 2 ways that you can talk about these concepts, okay, in your results and discussion section. Remember that the results and discussion section is 1 section, so we need to have a balance. We don't want to have too many results and not enough discussion. We don't want to have too few results and too much discussion. We want a good balance. So how do we achieve this balance? And we should always present the results first, then the discussion. I mean, that's stating the obvious, but sometimes we want to say that right off the bat, oh, this teacher, there's no logic in how the teacher forms questions.
Okay.
First, present the results. The teacher asked this type of question, and then later you can say, there appears to be no...
And I can say, for example, he mentioned in the interview that he tries to promote critical thinking, I don't know. But in the, I don't know, the transcription, well, the transcription showed that he doesn't do that.
Ahorita voy a explicar eso. Sí, pero sí. Sí. To answer your question, yes.
Okay.
All right, so here we have option 1. How can we present our results in discussion section? We have 1 option. Option 1. Every paragraph should begin with the topic sentence. Remember we talked a lot about meal plan, right? In the lit review? Yeah, the meal plan.
Yeah.
Same thing. But it's a little bit different now. All right, so in the results and discussion, we still need to have good paragraphs. 1 paragraph is 1 idea. Okay, 1 idea, 1 topic sentence, 1 idea. So you have topic sentence, and then you begin with your evidence sentences. So you have your topic sentence, this is the general idea of your paragraph. Then you have evidence, 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 and then link. So notice, in this example, option 1, we started with the main idea, the topic sentence. We have evidence sentences here, but we don't have any analyze sentences. The evidence sentence and your results and discussion are your results. The evidence are your results.
Okay.
This is different than the paragraphs that you did in the lit review, because evidence in the lit review was what? They were citations, right, from the experts. Now it's not the experts, it's you, because this is your research.
Okay.
You are providing the evidence, not someone else. Okay, so that's, in this case, we're still following the mill plan, but it's a little bit different now, because now you're talking about your own research. Does that make sense? All right, so the first option is you have topic sentence, evidence, evidence, evidence. Last sentence, always a link, a transition from this paragraph to the next. The second paragraph, we're going to start again with the topic sentence. Every paragraph should have a topic sentence. But now we're going to continue on with analyze sentences. Finish with the link. Whoops. So topic sentence, now the difference between these two, now we have all what? Analyze sentences. Analyze, what is analyze? Your discussion. Results are your evidence. So here, talk about your findings. These are your results. Second paragraph, your discussion. Next paragraph could do the same pattern. Your results. Next paragraph, your discussion. This discussion has to link exactly, very specifically to what you just mentioned. You could talk about what you mentioned here. You could also analyze this with something else that you mentioned earlier. That's fine too. It doesn't always have to be just this prior paragraph, but more than likely you're going to talk a lot about this paragraph. But speak very specifically to what you just mentioned. You want to balance between the two. We talked about the evidence first, the results, so we're okay, and then the discussion. We don't want to change this. We don't want to analyze first and then the results. Evidence first, then the results. Okay? Or I'm saying evidence. Evidence means results. Okay? Analyze, we're going to use that as discussion.
Okay. But here the evidence is what I have, right?
Yes.
But then in the
the analyze, and then when you discuss it, you're analyzing it. You're saying, now this is, you're interpreting. What does this mean? What does all this mean? Just like you said a while ago, there just doesn't seem to be any pattern. Okay, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? What do the experts say about that in your literature review? And you interpret that. This is now where you talk about your own opinion, right? Your perspective on what this evidence is. Is it good or bad? Now, this is now the difference than the meal plan that you used or applied in the lit review. The citations, the experts, are going to be part of your discussion, your analyze sentences. Remember, in the lit review, the citations were part of the evidence, right? Now they're going to be part of the analysis because it's part of the discussion, part of your discussion.
So here I'm going to include citations?
Yes, you can include some citations. Include some of your own interpretation, and then you can also mention experts and say, okay, this is according to what the experts say, or this is different than what the experts say. Now, second option. Again, we have our top sentence. We begin with evidence because we know we have to have results first. Okay, so it's right away evidence, some sort of evidence. Now, the evidence, I forgot to mention, where does the evidence come from? It comes from observations, interviews, and questionnaires. See? All this evidence is coming from this. See? Evidence, analyze, evidence, analyze, right, and then link. Now this is a simplification, but the idea is you're mixing the evidence and analyze together. Okay? You could have two evidence and analyze, and it's okay. It doesn't have to be evidence analyze, but but you're mixing the two.
Mhm.
Okay, so you're mixing your results and your discussion in one paragraph. And you go into the next. You can mix these two options. You can have your first paragraph like this, second paragraph like this, then a third paragraph like this, then a fourth paragraph like this, then a fifth paragraph like this, sixth paragraph like this. You can mix them. You can mix these options. So which one should you use? Depends. Depends on what? Depends on how difficult, what's the best way to be understood? What's the best way for me when I read it, or any reader, to read what you want to say about the results of discussion? Is it easier to be understood doing it this way? Or would it be just as easy to do it this way? And you have to make a decision. Which way it would be easier for someone to understand, because that's the goal here. This is the difficult part of the resulting discussion, is to be understood. You have all this information available in your head, all of these experiences that you've had over the last few weeks. Now you have to make someone else understand it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the challenge here. You have to think, okay, somebody has to read this. Somebody who hasn't spent hours and hours doing all this analysis, hours observing, talking to teachers, someone who knows nothing about my research. They have to understand my answer to my research questions. So what's the best way for me to lay it out simply? Don't try to be fancy or sophisticated. Just precise, accurate, clear, coherent, and just break it down into small pieces. Don't try to make sure you don't have super long paragraphs. Still think of that paragraph as that one idea. What's that one chunk of knowledge, information that you want to express? That's this. Okay. Now, this concept, you might need 2 or 3 paragraphs to explain, maybe. Okay. This doesn't necessarily mean paragraphs. These are concepts. So maybe this concept, you can do it in 1 paragraph, maybe. Or maybe you need 2 paragraphs to talk about this one concept. Okay.
So I need first the concept.
I would start with the concept. I would start with this. You need to have this complete in your head first before you start. You can do an outline. You can do a graphic organizer. You can do whatever you need to do, but have this in your mind before you start. Make sure that you have at least 2 data sources to talk about any of this stuff. And
for example, critical thinking, but something related to the promotion of the.
Well, this is like what and how. So how did the teacher present questions? So this is where you're going to be talking about the order in which, right? And maybe you don't have, you have to be careful on these interviews that you only include information about the how, not the why.
Okay.
See what I mean? So don't get confused with mixing. That's why this outline is very important. But you might have, okay, observations. You observed certain ways of how the teacher presented questions. Maybe you have some information in the questionnaire related to how they, or at least what type of questions that they ask and how they organize or prepare to ask questions. Okay, and look into your transcriptions for your interviews to see if you have any questions related to how and the what.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you then bring in, okay, so maybe you talk about content questions first, and then yes, no questions, or maybe you talk about do questions, maybe, or maybe you talk about exchanges first. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. It just depends on what you have available for for you. Use your codes. That's why use this to help you.
Okay.
If you do this thoroughly, you can get this information, these concepts from this. Maybe you have some categories and you talk about it, or maybe the theme 1 here, theme 2 here, or that, or category 1 here, category 2, subcategories, maybe.
Okay.
Always.
I do this and like it's going to be in the appendix and I upload it and you check it.
I can
Or-
check it, yeah. I mean, I'll be checking at the end, but if you want me to check it now at the moment that you upload it, if you have doubts, you're not sure, send me an email. Okay. Let me see. Is there anything else here that we need to talk about? Okay. One last thing. When you talk about the evidence, let's say you use a paragraph that you're only talking about your results. When you present your results, use transition words that compare and contrast within the paragraph. For instance, if you might say, the teacher told me that this. The
That's
question
the
is,
evidence, right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One teacher told me that they prepare for questions this way. And then here's the next evidence.
Okay.
But that's different than what I observed. I observed this, which was different than what the teacher told me.
Okay.
But that's different than what the teacher told me. That text, that is kind of a compare and contrast. Throw those in there in this paragraph. Or you might say, that's very similar to what I observed,
Okay.
which was the teacher did this.
Okay.
So see how I'm throwing in those comparisons? It's same, or it's different. But the questionnaire was totally different because they answered the question this way. You're helping the reader see at that moment, okay, there's some things that are different on the data sources, some things that are similar. But you're not really discussing it yet. You're just saying that it's either the similar or different.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you start talking about analyzing it, the reader remembers, oh yeah, I remember they told me that the question was different than the other two, and that makes sense when your analysis, see what I mean? If you don't make that very explicit, it gets kind of hard to they don't remember. Now, you know that it was different or what was similar. Make it explicit. Remind the reader that this was different than this and this and this. Okay, and then later when you talk about it, okay, then it makes sense. The reader kind of remembers. Okay, I remember now. So just kind of a note, and you can do that also with this option too, if it's the same paragraph. But try to, when you're triangulating the information, drop those bombs in there, those hints. Remember, this is similar, or remember, this is different from the other data sources.
That's going to be in the evidence. What you told me.
Yeah, what I'm referring to is the
yes.
evidence, right? Whether it's here or here.
Yeah, he told me that, but I observed that.
Right, and even if you just say, but I observed this, then that's okay.
Okay, but then in the, what was
Analyze?
Is it going to be the same or?
No, now you're going to interpret. Because these data sources were different, this means that, I mean, you don't have to say this means, but it says the teacher was, now you're making a judgment, you're critiquing, you're giving a critique. You're analyzing, you're saying this is good, this is bad. I mean, you don't have to use those words, good or bad, but you're saying this is a good way, or this is an effective way to help students because of da-da-da-da, or this may confuse students because they're doing this and this, and this is what Ellis says, too.
Maybe, can I use maybe? Maybe it's not very appropriate for the students.
Yeah, be careful with modals.
No,
just be careful. You can use some, but don't use too much because then you sound like wishy-washy.
Okay.
You want to sound a little bit more like you know what you're talking about. So just be careful with modals, even in here. A lot of times, just by taking out the modals, you sound more assertive and you sound, okay, you're an expert in this. Okay, you know your stuff and you're talking about your claim. So think of the analyze. I use the word analyze, but it could be critique, compare and contrast, even deeper. I mean, you could say, this is having this being more like this, and you can, it's more using your own higher order thinking skills, basically. And you might even think of words from Bloom's taxonomy. You might say, You might make small suggestions at that time. You know, at the end, you're going to make overall suggestions, but even still, you could say, having, if they did it this way, this would do this. See? And based on what Ella says, this would help students do this. See what I mean? So then you have the backing of an expert with your own analysis.
Right. Okay.
All right. Questions?
No, because I'm going to be more confused. So that's okay. It's a lot of information.
All right, it's a lot of information,
Yeah.
but take a look at these notes. Go back to today's reporting that we're doing today. Really sit down, get your head around the analysis. If you do this well, I think this kind of sets the stage for you now to start looking at this. If this is not really clear in your mind, this is harder. Okay? So really get your head around these codes, do the analysis thoroughly. And if you do this well, then this should fall into place. You should see. And this is only an example. You can order it however you want, but it needs to be logical. It needs to make sense. Why did you talk about this first and this first? Why did you talk about this first and then this and then this? Why this before this?
Okay.
You're okay?
Yes.
All right, so remember our dates. We have till May 16th, right, to finish this, and then we have until May 22nd to finish the entire paper. I had to move the due date one day earlier because we don't have class on May 23rd. So just a reminder that you have until May 22nd to finish the entire thesis.
Until the 16th?
Until the 16th for the results and discussion.
Which is next week?
Next Friday.
Next Friday.
And then you'll have the next week until next Thursday. You have basically 4 or 5 days to finish the abstract, the introduction, and conclusion.
And you're going to help us, right?
Of course. Of course. Yes, I'll help you. But the sooner that you can give me data, the better, the more feedback I can give you. Okay, so I mean, if you have something early that you upload, like for example our next tutoring session, if you have half of it uploaded, I'll look at what you have, or if you have an outline and whatever you have, I can give you feedback, and that you can save time instead of just looking at it at the end.
Excellent.
All right.
Okay.
All right, Lucy, hang in there. So, Fernando, come on in. How are you?